It is for sure an honor to co go, co organizing with Celine Castelrenard and Tom Lebrun this present online conference. It makes, to be honest, a couple of months, several months, that we consider this event. And in the beginning, we expect to organizing in real life conference. But after a couple of meetings, we decide to first regroup on a totally online activity, different people with different views coming from academic world, but also industry. And we will see in the future for sure that we'll be able to have a real conference, maybe in Ottawa next year. I'm particularly proud of this second panel, where we expect to deal with what we call substance of standards. Um, because after reading standards as a law professor, more and more, because law referring, as we see in the first panel, referring very commonly to standards in the law and in regulations, we feel it's important to to coincide these documents, to analyze them, and to see them in with different perspective and different disciplines. And, and for example, when we see ISO 42001, we see some common references to the fact that organization should assess and document the potential societal impact of their AI systems. So in the norms, in the standard itself, we see some references to, for example, to legal notions, and there is for sure some interaction now between standards and other disciplines. So that's the main idea we have uh, with Celine and Tom in this second panel. And as you see in the program, we are proposing a very pluridisciplinary approach with, in the order of the presentation of the panel, first a techie guy with Nicolas Poirier. Secondly, we will have a specialist of economic science, Professor Justus Baron. And not least, but at last, in the third position, an ethical scientist with Marta Ziosi. As you see, it's the first time it happens. We have three Marta in three different panels. If you consider that the moderator will be a lawyer, so for sure we are proposing a huge diversity of views or of views. But I don't want to take too much time. I'm pretty anxious when I see the first panel, which was very fluent with only two panelists. We have the same time, 75 minutes with three. So I will ask, as already mentioned, that each panel will be quite respectful of the 15 minutes you have to present yourself. And at the end, if everything is okay, we will have around 20 minutes with the audience. Please, we can begin with the first panelist. So let me just in a few words presenting Nicolas Poirier. So he's a graduate. He held a grad degree in mechanical engineering, and he is a strategy management consultant based in Quebec City. Since 2021, he has actively contributed to international standardization effort with ISO slash IEC, excuse me, participating in committee focusing on governance of organizations, artificial intelligence, digital convergence. So for sure, we have the pleasure to have a vision from an insider. So when we do some standards and with a technical perspective. So please, Nicolas, you have the mic.
Thank you very much, Professor Gautrais. I will share my screen. Um, Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be here and for this opportunity to to share with you some experience in standards writing, and to also discuss with all of you and my fellow panelists. As the first panel was going on, I changed my presentation quite a lot. I will try to mostly create links, but also to raise important questions. Obviously, looking at the first panel, I'm probably going to be one of the contrarians today. Being myself deep in the standardization, as Professor Gautrais was saying, I'm involved in standardization of artificial intelligence and governance of organization at the international level. Really quickly, I don't want to dive in too much into what is a standard, but keywords here: consistent rules, guidelines, or there are many definitions, but no matter the language we use: consistency, assurance, interoperability, and scale. Those four words are the cornerstone of almost any standards that is recognized internationally, no matter the forum. And those four will be useful today. Traditionally, the impact of standards, or let's say the common way of industries and governments since probably the end of the 1980s of talking about standard, is always framing it in, let's say, the free flow of the market economy. Always a link to safety and quality, obviously, but that framework, or let's say that frame of communication, was always more about trade than about the social impact, for example. And as we've seen in the last 20 years, sustainability and broader societal impact of what organizations are doing is taking more and more importance. So this is one of the issues that seems to arise when we talk about AI standardization in different contexts, is we tend to look at standardization with the old frame of mind, but with the new perspective, standardization in the old way of describing it, but with the new frame of mind, which puts more often than not sustainability at the heart of what organizations are doing. In the specific context of AI, we have new challenges. It's true, but maybe not that new challenges. So in the context of standardization, there is a lot of tools that exist, and structure and stakeholder structure that we might not be using to their full potential right now. Professor Laroche mentioned it a little bit, but there are generally four types of international standardization organization. The traditional one, ISO, International Standardization Organization, the Electrotechnical Commission, ITU, which are generally based on participation by countries, and industry-specific standard bodies. Unicode, the language we use that is at the heart of creating language and computer. The USB standard is another example. So basically, groups of industry-specific organizations get together and build standards that are in time used across the globe, regional and sector-specific. So Sentinelec is a good example. We've mentioned it earlier on. W3C is the consortium for the web technologies that are used in browser, for examples. And emerging tech and niche standard, Chronos and IEEE are example, but those, let's say, in the context of AR, are a little less common. Today, I will be mostly focusing on ISO because it's where I do standardization, but it, from a general perspective, gives a great overview. ISO, as other international standardization organization, has its participation based on country. Almost any country in the world can join, and as it has evolved over time, more and more technical committees got created, and then countries can choose to get involved in one or not, depending on their national needs and their the role of the discipline-specific area of standardization in their own economy. This is the membership of the Committee on the Standardization of Artificial Intelligence, which is a joint between ISO and the Electrotechnical Commission. So as we can see, the representation of stakeholder across the world is not perfect. There are, from memory, a little less than 70 members that are voting, and a couple other more, but there are regions in the world that are not represented. So, as one of the other panelists was mentioning earlier on, do we have, let's say, an international forum to standardize internationally? That's a good question. As we start building standardization, everything is consensus based in most international organizations, but in ISO particularly, meaning that it's not a majority vote. It's trying to reach a consensus to make sure that the standards will be used in a manner that is as wide as possible and across jurisdiction. One of the key challenge, and it applies even more in the context of AI, is how do we bridge the gap between the background and the perspective of stakeholders. I took, for example, only three of the generic ISO stakeholders: enterprises, so large and small, consumers, and labor. And this is interesting. This is really interesting in the context of AI because when we do a standard, for example, on human oversight of AI system, we have a train or public transportation that is operated or that may be operated in the future by an AI system. When you sit down at a table and try to do the engineering part of human oversight, the control points, the explainability, and so forth, and then after that, you try to generalize or standardize the language of human oversight of the AI system itself. How do you describe it? And after that, when you have to build the governance and management of that human oversight so it is applicable, it sometimes get really hard to have every single stakeholder participate at every level. And that's one of the key challenge of the current ISO structure. For example, when you're at the engineering level, what you are doing and defining, let's say, the control point, the interface, and everything that has to be standardized around that, and you have the perspective of the consumer and the perspective of labor, it's often hard to create the discussion for that perspective to be quote unquote translated on the engineering part. And it's the same thing at the quote unquote, let's say, higher level of abstraction where you are in governance and management of human oversight. Sometimes with the technical experts, their perspective is so much based on the engineering side that getting them to management and governance becomes harder. So in the context of AI, in the standardization of the field itself, bridging the gap between the stakeholders is a key challenge that also impacts indirectly regulations. Professor Laroche said earlier on, and I'm sorry, don't hesitate to jump in. I missed the beginning of the quote, but it was ending in getting the type of deliberation that we need. This is a really interesting thing because one of the main challenges for international standardization organization is the fact that sometimes they are unknown and sometimes their field of standardization is highly known, but the participation and the ability of experts around the world to participate is way less well known. So the ISO process to deliberate, to reach consensus, and to build standard is actually a quite strong one and a quite resilient one. It has some flaws, obviously, because it's stakeholder dependent and then it's national, it's a country dependent. So we have to make sure we take that into account. But the forum to develop standards that are, let's say, representative of the need across the jurisdiction already exists. So, Professor Laroche, I'll be happy in the discussion to speak on that. One interesting example of the seemingly low impact challenges of doing international standardization is AI governance. each and every single time I have heard the expression AI governance used this morning, I could probably frame it into four different meaning if I take the perspective of how we standardize AI in governance at the international level, both the governance of organization, the governance of IT, and the governance of AI. So one other thing to keep in mind as we are having those conversation on the role of standards and regulation is how do we create a shared understanding and make sure we are talking about the same thing um, when we speak together. I'll accelerate just a little bit to make sure I get to the points I want to make. Um, one of the other challenges we have is that too often when we talk about standardization in AI, we forget the performance principle, which comes from a couple decades ago, where at the international level we started to say we need to create requirements, mostly in safety and quality at the beginning, that are related to the performance of the product or services in AI, for example, rather than on design descriptive characteristics. And this creates a really interesting challenge in AI because in the context of AI, because sometimes performance, it's easy to mix performance and characteristics because when you're talking about, let's say, trustworthiness of an AI system, it's really hard because if you get into the performance, you go at the engineering level, at the output level, at the impact level. So what we have, what we are, what we have found as we are standardizing more and more and more in AI is that that principle, the performance principle, yes, it allows for maximum technical freedom and it reduces the risk of undesirable effect in the market. But because it's so hard in the context of AI to see where you are standardizing outcomes rather than characteristics, this creates a part of let's say, the harder boundaries in the middle between standardization and regulation. Um, Again, for example, when we try, I'll take my example of human oversight again. When we do human oversight, if we focus the standardization activities strictly on the risk and the level of the risk, we are going to end up in a situation where it's going to be really, really difficult for the standard to apply across jurisdiction. And rather than that, we have in the past standardized the outcome we want to achieve, the measurement of the risk, and the broader range of those risks. But it's not too often that specifically in international standard, we establish specific criterias. And looking at, for example, what's going on with the AUAI Act, it's those situations that create an imbalance on the more traditional performance-based standard and the reality and the imperatives of national governments and supranational governments to establish criteria and boundaries in the use of AI, for example. One other interesting thing is we often hear that it is really complex to take into account the impact of AI on society, and that it's maybe not a place for standardization to do that. But if we just jump out of AI a little bit and go into the governance of organization, we have already standardized the governance of how an organization should govern itself to be purpose-driven and make sure that it promotes sustainable development and consider its societal impacts. And as two other really more technical example, modern slavery and violence against women. In the context of organization, we are currently standardizing those two discipline-specific area, one from a requirement perspective based on the performance principle, and the other from the more general risk approach. So if we are able at the international level to get a lot of countries together, and I'm sure some of the countries that are around the table would surprise many of you, but because we keep the discussion on the performance principle and how to manage the risk and how to make sure that organization can measure impact and the effect of the intended result of their activities in those domains, we are able to make sure that the resulting standard can be used across the world. That does not impede the right of any country to establish a different regulatory environment. It just helps organization comply with those requirements. But the challenge is, no matter if we are having building standards in critical areas, either from the more governance or social side or within the AI community, the really big adoption challenges are addressing market need and timely delivery. Again, for example, the governance standard dates from 2021, and its rate of adoption is really slow because being a purpose-driven organization, it's getting there slowly, but there's no market forces that are nudging really actively organization to make sure they move to a purpose-driven approach. And here, a market need can be the regulatory forces. It can be many things. So in the context of AI, that's also a thing we have in mind as we standardize. No matter the quantity of standards we write, if they are not answering a market need, again, I'm taking market in a really wide perspective here, they just won't be used. Same thing for the timely delivery. It's still hard to write a standard in a short period of time. In the context of AI, even more because of the accelerating pace of changes, but also because some areas of AI are really new, 6 months, 1 year. So it gets hard to standardize what's going on when it's almost not documented yet. Mr. Cantello-Gamito said earlier on that standards should serve as an ethical baseline. I would disagree a little bit here because, and that's the interesting line between building standard based on the performance principle and using standard in the context of a regulatory environment. If we say we're going to use the standardization process to define the ethical baseline of society, I'm not sure it's going to work. Although, if the ethical baseline is established by public policymaking, and after that, you use standardization to manage the risk and also to better understand how AI system works and how we measure their impact, then the standards can be used by public policymakers to say, we are establishing as a society how we want to govern this part, and this part of AI, and use the tools at your disposal to do that. And in Canada, we have done that for many things. Not in AI yet, but in privacy rights, in health and safety, obviously, in preventing all forms of violence. So I think that here sometimes our shared understanding decreases when we blur the line between, I'll call them documents, but a document creating or formalizing requirements, for example, around AI in a standard, and requirements that can look really similar in a regulation. Back in the context of AI, the accelerating pace of technological development and the increasing societal impact are obviously driving a big part of the standardization world. But where we are getting a little behind is that we forget that we already have strong foundations. And for example, following the EU standardization request, Sense started building standards to answer the request, but in some cases, and we don't know yet how it's going to end, but in some cases, they went away of the international best practice around managing systems in organizations. So in the context of AI, one of the only levers we have to make sure that standards can keep up to the the pace of technological development is to make sure that strong foundational standards that are used across the world, 9001, which is the quality management system, for example, and on which the artificial intelligence management system is built, that we use those as much as possible, because that's simply how to optimally manage something. And you can build any regulation over 9001 and 42001, and those two simply will help you make sure that you are meeting your compliance obligation. So sometimes we are forgetting what has been done in the past, and doing that makes the perception around new government regulation, let's say, either not enough, as we have seen in some jurisdictions, or either too much, or creating too much rigidity. Again, an example: governance of Organization for Sustainable Development is already standardized, agreed internationally, and widely agreed internationally. So there's nothing impeding us to say we are going to take care of the broader impact of AI system from a standardization perspective. Two key issues. I'm winding down.
Excuse me, Nicolas, I have to ask you to go to your conclusions. And
Perfect.
sorry
Two
about
key
that.
issues as I'm winding down: the awareness of impact of standard, and okay, I'm going to skip that one. I'll keep it. My conclusion is the role of standards in AI regulation. It needs one thing that it does not have right now. It's creating a shared understanding, because we are talking about the same thing in different contexts, and it's just creating a big wedge between the standards and what should be in a standard and what should be in a regulation. So the solution to that is obviously standardizing more what we are talking about, and closing in. At some point, we will need to stop talking and get involved. One of the key challenges we have in standardizing in AI is finding volunteers and finding organizations that want to get involved at the international level. And many countries have it. We have it. So that's probably the easiest way to make an impact on the broader ecosystem. So I'm inviting everybody, if you're from Canada and want to get involved, you can go to the Standard Council website and just jump in to participate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the last invitation to be more involved in the standardization process. So thank you so much, and sorry to have to short your presentations, but thank you so much for your technical perspective. Thank you for your agility to make some link with the first panel, and thank you for showing all the overlap there is between the different disciplines. So. I go now to Dr. Justus Barron, which is a senior researcher associated in the Seal Center of Law, Regulation, and Economic Growth in Northwestern University in Chicago. His area of expertise is empirical economic analysis of technological innovation and market for technologies. His main research interest are technology standards. That's why he's here today, patents and licensing schemes. Justus holds a PhD in economics from Mines Paris Tech and a master degree in economic governance from Sciences Po Paris. Justus will be in charge to develop a more general economical perspective, and maybe if you succeed to manage your 15 minutes constraint, maybe as we discussed previously, you will be able to consider question of representation and inclusion of diverse perspective in standard consensus. So please, Justus.
Thank you very much, Professor Gautrais, for the invitation to be here today. It's a humbling experience to speak on AI standardization, which is not a core issue of my expertise. I've done quite a lot of thinking and writing about standards in general, but I'm certainly not an AI standardization expert, and definitely not a standardization participant in AI, such as our previous speaker was. But I thought that I can still bring to the table some general thoughts on AI standardization, in particular from the perspective of the economics of standardization. So I thought it's worth to take one step back and to invite the audience to think about like the types of standards, because I think each of these traditionally recognized types of standards plays some role in AI standardization as well. So standards are actually, there are more than just these two broad families of standards that we have been talking about, like interoperability and safety. And I think that they're not particularly applicable in the field of AI necessarily. So I think that there's, for instance, terminology standards, there's measurement standards, there's quality standards, there's safety, health, and environment standards, there's testing and conformity assessment standards, there's interoperability standards, and then there's just generally variety reduction standards. All these are types of standards that we have seen in many other technological fields before. And I think that there's a room or role for each of these types of standards in the field of AI as well. And these broad types of standards, to some extent, they map to different economic functions of standards. So I would say at the broadest level of description, what a standard is doing is it's to provide objective information on best practices and the state of the art in a particular field. And often by doing so, it aims to eliminate or reduce excess variety. So these are kind of primary objectives of standards, which then lead to these recognized secondary objectives, such as facilitate transactions and coordination, overcome asymmetric information between different agents, support regulation and the enforcement of existing rules, and then support an industrial organization that has attractive characteristics such as modularity, meaning that different agents, economic agents, can participate in specialized roles and can collaborate in flexible ways, allows specialization, and it encourages competition between different agents at different levels. So this is, generally speaking, the economic analysis and of the types and functions of standards. And it's clear that when we think about AI, there's a lot of attractiveness to this general description of what standards do. I mean, if we think about, we want trustworthy AI. So AI is a field where like this asymmetric information between the users and the developers of the technology is particularly acute, particularly strong. I mean, there's a lot of experience of users with using AI that they don't fully understand, and there's reluctance to use AI. So there's tons of anecdotes of people using AI and then finding out that the AI didn't really do what they thought it would do. So I mean, just translating like the functioning of the AI to the user is an important function. And then beyond these quality that matters to the user itself directly, there are like these broader social considerations that we've heard about quite a lot already, like these ethical concerns, but also like the liability for in violation of certain laws, such as IP laws. And then there's these more like its broader systemic risks involved in generalized use of AI, which call for regulation of these systems. And we think that standards can play a very helpful role in supporting that regulation. And then obviously we would like AI to be efficient. So we would like to improve interactions between different AIs, also between different applications of AI. In some fields, such as autonomous driving or advanced manufacturing, we're kind of building complex systems where different components have to interoperate in seamless ways. So all this is an argument for economic efficiency, where we think that standardization is important and can play an important role. And also, it's a tool to produce these systems, produce these technologies in an industrial organization that is attractive, meaning that we allow systems to grow large, leverage network effects, leverage economies of scale without creating like these powerful monopolies or powerful dominating companies that are difficult to regulate. So ideally, we would like to have a system where there are standardized interfaces so that there is competition while everybody is using certain shared elements that are not so without any kind of wasteful duplication here. And so it's clear that it's an attractive idea to have an AI that is more governed by standards, that is more standardized. And it's also clear that it's a field in which subject matter expertise is very important and where the technology itself is highly globalized. So it's difficult for national regulators to actually meaningfully contribute here. So all this really makes it very attractive that these standards, that this degree of standardization is produced through voluntary international standards. So this is certainly an attractive ideal. So from my humble outsider's perspective, it's not necessarily always clear that the existing AI standardization fulfills these promises, or at least not yet, or at least not to the full extent. So my understanding is that much of SDO standards development concentrates on terminology, measurement, which to some extent might be called like these low-tech aspects of standardization. And it's often portrayed, at least, I'm not entirely in a position to verify that, but I mean, it's portrayed as being standardization that is driven by, to some extent, outsiders. So there's a lack of engagement from the main developers, be it at the organizational level, be it at the individual level. And to some extent, we even see it on the country level. So we see that countries and regions that are very interested in AI standardization are not necessarily the countries that are at the forefront in developing AI. And also we know that the industrial, like the structure of these technologies is not necessarily particularly well suited to being standardized. So it's a technology that is currently undergoing dramatic technological development with successive waves of creative destruction. So it's difficult to really stabilize something and describe commonly understood best practices in a field that is changing in a matter of weeks. And at the same time, it's already exhibiting tendencies to monopolization, at least at certain relevant bottlenecks. So many of these things that we want to avoid are already taking place. And finally, the industry structure and also like the geopolitical context are pushing companies and pushing actors in this sphere to not be overly concerned with the risks that they take. So there's more like a concern to be left behind, not to lose the race. And in that general context, encouraging actors to be more concerned about like the implications and the best practices and societal impacts of their activities is a difficult sell. And so on top of that, or at the same time, this international voluntary standard system that Nicolas has presented is itself also facing criticisms from people who are also at the outside from that system. And so on one hand, we have a societal critique. So we have people who are disappointed with the extent of representation of different societal interest groups, lack of diversity in terms of gender, in terms of nationality, in terms of educational profiles, and so on and so on. And we have, for example, seen in the European standardization strategy that kind of echoes these themes and encourages standardization bodies to be even more concerned about these societal concerns. At the same time, we see that kind of there's a little bit of a divergence in the universe of standardization bodies, where we have some organizations that are more concerned with this type of societal aspects. And these bodies, such as the infrastructure, like the organizational structure around ISO, they are lagging, at least in certain fields of IT, they're lagging other organizations that are more agile, that are where companies themselves are more represented. And so it's at some points, and that's very evident in the European standardization strategy, we kind of have this situation where we're pushing one type of standardization bodies to do more and more in terms of their societal representativeness, while these bodies are at the same time struggling to keep up with the pace of technology development, where other types of bodies that are much less representative are actually more successful. So next to the societal critique, there is just this general tension, or I think it's fair to call it a crisis of globalization in general, where we basically have all these different pillars of the global order that are being fragilized by this geopolitical rivalry between forces such as the US and China. And in this context, a lot of the policy concerns, especially in the United States, as Belarus has said, are more about the international competitiveness of the US actors rather than about the ability of the system to deliver standards that support regulation. And finally, we can say that these two different concerns, the concern over competitiveness and the concern over to the extent to which standards represent values, are a little bit in tension, which we have, as also Pilar said, we have seen in the EU, where there has been like a reckoning about the scale or scope of the ambitions of the EU to regulate and to have a value-driven approach, which has led to withdrawal of some of the latest initiatives. So what I wanted to do is to just really go and have a quick look at this list of procedural quality principles that we have and that has developed over time in the field of international standardization in general, and to try to see a little bit how it maps to the needs of AI. And so there's a number of lists of different procedural principles. These lists are not always necessarily exactly the same, but I think that there's kind of a short list of principles that many people subscribe to, which is that standards should be consensus-driven, should be open, should exhibit a balance of interests between different groups. There should not be dominance by any particular interest, and there should be due process characterized, for example, by the availability of appeal. So this has been described as an approach of input legitimacy. So we are focusing on the procedural quality, a little bit reflecting the thinking that the subject matter experts are best positioned to know what is a good standard. So as long as they follow due process and good quality processes to get to this outcome, then we can trust and to some extent defer to this body of subject matter experts to come up with standards that we as the rest of society are not in the capacity to evaluate on their technical merit. But what I would submit is that these procedural principles, they are actually a blend of three different traditions, and we should be more conscious about which of these traditions we really build on, because each of these traditions supports a different goal for standards. And I think that especially in AI, mixing these traditions leads to confusion and not necessarily helpful policy outcomes. So the first tradition that I would identify is a tradition that comes from the development of product standards. So it's really basically going all the way back to the steel manufacturers that standardized steel for the railroads. So we have commercial goods, and we have transactions between different actors, and standards exist to facilitate transaction between different actors. And these are typically vertically related to each other. So it's a customer and a producer, it's a manufacturer and its supplier. And basically they want to standardize the characteristics of the good that is being exchanged. And this is a quality matter. This is a matter of information here. To some extent, a matter of interoperability. So when we are concerned about process here in this context, we are mostly concerned about the representation of these different interests. And that's mostly a concern of the relevance. So if we are not including the potential customers of the good, then these potential customers are just not using the good. And if we're not including the supplier of the good in the process of developing the standard, then we might create a standard that these suppliers are just not able to follow. So it's kind of a simple matter of technical relevance that we want to have balance. We want to have representation of these different groups. And when it comes to technology standards, that's an entirely different thing. So these are technologies that are developed simultaneously with the standard itself, where basically the development of the standard is inseparable from the development of the technology itself. So these are complex technical systems defined by standards. So think of the internet, think of telecommunication standards, think of some consumer electronic standards. So this is basically, the standard is inseparable from the technology. So when we talk about something like 5G, that is at the same time a standard and a technology. So here we are talking about a situation in which many, many different companies want to participate because they want to compete in that industry. They want to propose their proprietary solutions. There's intense rivalry over the leadership in that development. And here, the good process that we're concerned about is that this process is open and that it's characterized by absence of dominance. And that's primarily a concern out of competition policy. We want this to be a fair and open competition for the best solution to emerge from this technological rivalry. And then finally, we have a tradition that is really rooted in what I would call professional standards. So these are basically the tradition of professional associations, such as engineering societies, but it's not very different from bar associations, medical associations. So these are associations of people exercising a clearly defined, what I would call learned professions. So they are recognized by society as expert in a particular field. This particular profession is governed by particular norms. So these people have a certain ethos, a certain way of conducting themselves. They have peer pressure to be recognized by their peers. And we have a goal of achieving some kind of consensus among these subject matter experts on certain things that are to be considered objectively true. So the goal of this procedural quality here is to develop a standard that is just fundamentally true. It's a truth value to the standard that matters here. And this objective truth value, this quality of the standard as being something that is an accurate, learned, and relevant description of technical information, is then the basis for potential normative functions of the standard. It's because it is objectively true that it can be incorporated in regulation, that it can for example, be referred to in liability issues and other measures. So basically where we basically ascribe a normative function to this just because it is just the relevant state of the art. Therefore, somebody who exercises this some activity in this field is to be expected to follow these rules. And then I would say this heightened expectation of societal representation in these procedures, that is really a consequence of this normative function that these standards acquire. But it's not. Sometimes it gets a little bit mixed in my view, that we kind of say, okay, there is these standards deal with policy, and therefore there needs to be societal representation. I think that the first principle is, if we want to use this to support regulation, or if this is to acquire some normative force, then this is because there's some objective quality to it. And this is because it is a consensus among the people who have technical expert knowledge in the field that it has this quality. And this societal representation, then, Pierre Larouche and I have written about that. We think that it's a matter of epistemic representation. It's basically just making sure that different viewpoints that are informed by people's different experience are also represented in that process. But it gets often mixed with some kind of pseudo-democratic form of representation, where it's kind of we're having like this slow transition to something that is often represented to be something that should be more like a democratic representative process, which I think is a fundamental mistake. And so basically, in terms of the path forward, I think there is a number of things to be taken away from this very general analysis. First is, we need to remember standards development is not the same thing as standardization. So standardization is the process of moving a system towards greater reliance on standards. That doesn't necessarily involve documentary standards, and production of documentary standards does not necessarily lead to standardization. Sometimes, and I think that's a little bit the case of AI, you have too many different people who are volunteering to produce documentary standards, and that creates variety, that creates confusion more than it creates clarity and standardization. And related to this point, if you observe regulatory vacuum in a particular field because there are actors out there that are not following rules and that are unbound by rules, and you observe that existing systems of regulation are unable to harness these and like unable to control these actors, standards alone will not fill that regulatory vacuum. If there's a normative void, it's not because some people can get together in a room to describe best practices that this will automatically create normative power and that this will automatically control these actors. So one of the first imperatives is to make sure that the people who you want to be bound by these rules, they actually participate in creating these rules. And this is to my understanding, it's really like one of the basic premises why voluntary standardization is successful is because basically the people who are expected to be bound by this themselves have participated in creating this. And you have to be clear about what kind of standard you're actually creating here, because if it's a product standard, then it's really a matter of it's a transaction between the developers and the adopters of that AI. If it's a technology standard, which as we have seen is very attractive for the industrial organization of AI, we think that as society we would greatly benefit from having an AI technology that is more governed by technology standards. But then it's still a matter of technological performance, and like it's just like let the best win, and you cannot overfraud that process with democratic principles. That's just antithetical to the technological meritocratic notion of technology development or technology standards development. And for this professional standard,
Justus,
yes,
excuse me, Justus, you have to interrupt you, or maybe a few seconds for your conclusion.
And just last sentence, so like it's whereas this type of standard that, especially in the EU, like the EU seems to be particularly looking forward to is like these standards that can support regulation, which would be more akin to like the safety and health standards. I think that these standards need to reflect shared understanding in a profession of experts, and for that you first have to have this solid social group that needs to emerge, which has solid shared norms, and these standards, like this solid shared understanding within that profession of AI experts, can only acquire normative functions subject to a social contract with the rest of society, where basically we have something similar to the engineer that has a clearly defined role in society, recognized by society, or the doctor or the lawyer. So this is something that, to my mind, is something that comes very late in the process of the maturation of a technology. So I think that clarifying like these different traditions might help to see what kind of processes we would need for AI standardization. I'm sorry for going over time. I'm done with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justus. I'm sorry for that. It's very interesting, but we still have 20 minutes in this panel. But hopefully, Nicolas already answered to many questions we have in the chat. But please, Marta Ziosi, just a few words to present you. So Marta is a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Martin AI Governance Initiative, where her research focuses on standards for advanced AI. Marta has a background in policy, philosophy, and mathematics, and she holds a PhD in algorithmic bias from the Oxford Internet Institute. She currently, as many know, serves as a vice chair of the EU JPIA Code of Practice. So thank you, Marta, for finishing your week with us and speaking from UK. Good to have you.
Thank you so much, Vincent. Can you see my screen and can you hear me well?
Wonderful.
Perfect. So thank you so much for having me here. Today, I'm just going to talk about the substance of standards, trying to sort of like add on to what the previous speakers have said and to add some hopefully relevant considerations. I thought that for today, what would be interesting to talk about is a research that I've been conducting with a colleague of mine here at Oxford. We got a grant from the ISO to sort of like scope out the state of standards for advanced AI currently out there in the world, and sort of looking at the main challenges in standardizing advanced AI, and at the same time sort of outlining some of the ways and paths forward. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. To begin with, hopefully this goes. Wait. Yes. So Justus presented useful typology, a classic division into task standards, measurement standards, process standards. And there's another division, I think, that emerges when you look and scope out the state of standards for AI that is out there. Often in circles about standardization, there's lots of talks about technical interoperability and the importance of standards for AI dealing with technical interoperability. And there's certainly some truth to that, but that's not the only story when we scope out and look at which standards are being developed out there for AI. So on one hand, a big chunk and cluster that emerges is clearly interconnectivity standards. And here, what we can think about is first technological interconnectivity. So here we're really thinking about technical interoperability. Those are the kind of standards that we have in mind when we think about the internet, for example, or when also we think about more analog products like railroad gauges and things that really have to work together in order for a system to work holistically. When we look into standards, there are some examples of standards for technical interoperability. For example, there are standards on cloud interoperability that have been developed. And there's a little bit of standards dealing with this kind of interoperability at the level of open source. There's something called the Open Neural Network Exchange, for example, that allows you to sort of run machine learning frameworks in different libraries. So that's a bit of standard, that a cluster of standard that is being dealt with and is dealing with technological interconnectivity. Then about interconnectivity, that is another important aspect, which is transactional interconnectivity. And that's something that makes us think about, for example, standardized contracts. In that sense, that's sort of a cluster that has not been so present in standardization of AI so far, apart from, once again, more like in open weight models and open source models, where we talk about responsible AI licenses, which is something where we've seen development of standard-like documents for the purpose of transactional interconnectivity. Yet we get to another function that standards can usefully play in AI, and it's much more to do with externalities. So something that we have come across in our research is that many of the standards that are already out there, especially when we talk about standards within ISO, for example, or very broad SDOs, are standards dealing with externalities. What do I mean by externality? On one hand, standards dealing with physical externalities. A physical externality could be like pollution, for example, but when it really comes down to AI, a physical externality would be like trying to make AI safer, trying to make AI more ethical, for example. And here we see loads of standards coming up on trustworthiness, for example, on testing when it comes to safety. And then there's another bit of externality, which is relevant, and is standards dealing with policy externalities. And here are standards dealing and trying to make compliance uniform across countries and across jurisdictions. And here we've seen the emergence of, for example, risk management standards that have been sort of rising more and more onto the horizon. So that's just sort of to set the stage for which kind of standards we are seeing emerging when we look out there. There's often, like, because of an inheritance of internet standards, sort of like an ease to go and think about technical interoperability as the main function that standards are playing. But currently we see an emergence of standards really dealing with this kind of externalities. And I think that's interesting enough to cite. Then the next step of our research was we set the stage and we asked to 50 plus experts in AI standardization, what are the challenges you see in standardizing AI? And especially what we had in mind at this stage was in the development of standards and also in the substance of standards. And here I present to you three of the main things that sort of emerged, which, by the way, came up in some of the previous presentations, but is useful to see as a sort of like big emerging clusters here. On one hand, many questions arouse around development and adoption of standards. So there is an increasingly emerging landscape, but because of the structure of many SDOs, that is not necessarily top down for how standards are created, but more like bottom up. There is a big emergence with a lack of a clear coherence among different standards initiatives. So often there is a bit of a confusion as per which standards should be developed first or which standards should be adopted. And this, of course, contrasts a little bit with the idea of the uniqueness of standards. At the same time, there's also a big question of the right level of abstraction or the right tool that is necessary to tackle a certain issue. within AI. So we often talk about standards, but we also have something called like technical specifications, technical report. There are many pre-standardization tools that can be used beyond just standards or at different timings, depending on how ripe or not ripe the issue at hand is. And that's also something that came up as relevant and as not known enough within the realm and the discourse around standardization and AI. Now, another very interesting point, which I guess is the big elephant in the room, is the complexity of the technology. This came up several times, of course. When we started our project, we were looking at LLMs more specifically, and now it's interesting to see how agentic AI is already the new buzzword. And of course, on one hand, we're talking about buzzwords, but on the other hand, we're also talking about continuously shifting paradigm, which is not easy to keep up with when you're dealing with something like standardization, which tries to get at what we have here, which is consensus, especially scientific and technical consensus on important issues. So that's something that has come up with as a very, very big challenge when it comes to especially advanced AI, a type of technology that is increasingly changing. And then last challenge, it's something that touches upon representation, but not only representation. And it's just the fact that because of its complexity and its widespread use, AI is mostly used at the interface with society. And this makes it be a socio-technical kind of artifact and technology. This means that there are different issues that come up from the classic issues that SDOs have been traditionally used to deal with. Often SDOs have had to deal with many technical topics, which have been, of course, complex, but not always so value-laden or not as value-laden as AI right now. One of the points of our research was, for example, to look into standards for bias and fairness. And you can imagine how difficult it is in that case to really come up with such a standard. ISO, for example, has a technical report on bias in AI systems. And over there, bias is presented as a sort of special accuracy problem. And the reason could just be because it's not easy to standardize value-laden issues. And there's a big question here as per whether like standards should at all be a place and an avenue for standardizing such issues, or whether they should be dealt with in a different way. And then, of course, comes the aspect of representation, of course, that Justus also talked about, that becomes increasingly relevant when we're talking about socio-technical aspects of AI, the sort of aspect of including multiple voices. And it's not just sort of minorities in that sense, but in terms of also representation from multiple countries, like Global South representative, for example, that often are on the map and yet do not have the capacity to participate in the same way as other big tech actors, for example. And another big stakeholder is academics, of course. It would be great to see more representation of academics within these bodies, but often there's a big lack of incentives for that to happen, which does not help. So these are three of the main challenges, but I do not want to leave you here today with just challenges. We tried to come up with some of the ways forward from here. I'm just going to sort of quickly skim over them and then really go deeply into some of them and to get as pragmatic as possible. So when we talk about problems around development and adoption of standards, something that would be an easy and a low-hanging fruit in order to, like, as a way forward, would be to establish more partnerships and liaisons. I'm going to go more into that soon. When we come to the problem of complexity, we draw a useful distinction, hopefully, between what we see as trailing standards and leading edge standards. So standards that deal with different issues and at different levels of abstraction when it comes to advanced AI. And when we're thinking about socio-technical challenges, instead, many of the potential ways forward are to be found in training programs, grants, and serious avenues for reform. But here, let's sort of like zoom in into each of these potential ways forward, and let's really have a look at what they could look like. So in terms of challenges with standards development and adoption, there is a big possibility for SDOs to collaborate more. Now, many of you here already know how SDOs work. So you know that there are already many important partnerships between some of these SDOs. A big example is ISO and IC working together on standards, especially in SC42 on AI. IEEE, for example, has liaison status in SC42. So one might say there's already lots of collaboration going on. And that's true. At the same time, there's still quite some overlap between some of the working programs. And there is, as we said before, this emergence of standards without clear coherence often. So things like memorandum of understandings, for example, would really help trying to get to that coherence and trying to reduce overlap between these different SDOs and their work. But what we think is really important and special when it comes to standardization of advanced AI is more the second bit, which is the role of consortia, for example, and government agencies, where often there is more specialized expertise when it comes to advanced AI, and yet these bodies are not yet well represented within SDOs. Since the beginning of our research, this has changed for some of these bodies. For example, industry consortia like ML Commons now holds liaison status within SC42 and thus can participate in the process. But it's less so the case for government agencies like, for example, ACEs, AI Safety or Security Institutes, would be a great sort of institution to feed into current standard development organizations and processes. And yet we're not seeing loads of that movement and engagement going on there, which we see as a great avenue for opportunity. Now, when it comes to the complexity of that technology, we talked about different artifacts beyond standards that can be used. We have standards, we have technical specifications, technical reports, many pre-standardization items. And at the same time, we have identified here classic SDOs, but also an emergence of different kind of pseudo-standard actors. So we drew a distinction between what we see as trailing edge standards, which are standards for sort of mature governance questions, and standards that arrive and tackle more high-level issues. And we think that such standards, so trailing edge standards, would be best for SDOs to keep on producing, as they're best placed with their robust standardization processes that have been built through the years to sort of continue developing such standards. Yet, when it comes to really specific aspects that are really leading with, like, or dealing with the cutting edge of advanced AI, we think that there's an opportunity there for specifications rather than standards straight away to be developed on cutting edge specific aspects. And we think that in that sense, consortia and government agencies that are like AI Safety or Security Institutes, they are best placed to develop such artifacts and then interface and inform the work of SDOs going forward, because of the nature and the complex nature and the fast changing nature of advanced AI. Now, last challenge, socio-technical challenges around the development as a substance of standards for advanced AI. On one hand, we talked about participation, and there are grants, especially for actors coming from the Global South, that are present in bodies like ISO. However, there's less so in the case of specific AI committees, and it would be great to see more grants being directed at Global South representation in SC42, for example. And at the same time, it would be great to see more incentives for academics to participate, because there's two kind of ideas of representation. On one hand is sort of the number idea of it, just being present. But another thing is sort of being able to meaningfully and consistently contribute to the standard development process. And that's something that is much more difficult given the lack of incentives, sadly, around standardization of advanced AI. Another really important aspect, we think, is given the current pace at which technology is developing, there are many institutional sort of burdens and processes that are slow currently within SDOs, but at the same time, there is a wealth of different paths that can be explored within those SDOs themselves that can be revised and can be used further. One example is, for example, publicly available specifications are a thing. Fast track options within SDOs like ISO can be explored. And at the same time, things like quicker updating for specific ad hoc cases where a standard really needs a specific updating given a current issue. That's something that can be explored when dealing with SDO processes. So yeah, I have sort of sketched out all these challenges. These are some of the ways forward. Of course, there are many more challenges and many different ways of going about solving these problems, but I thought this would be useful to sort of kickstart a conversation and hopefully open the floor for more questions from the audience. I just wanted to thank you so much, Vincent, for inviting me, and yeah, looking forward to the questions. Hopefully we still have time.
So thank you so much, Justus, Nicholas, and Marta, for your expertise. It was a pleasure, and for sure we need to have other meetings on the same topic in the near future. Thank you so much, and we come back in 10 minutes for the last panel, directed and moderated by Tom Lebrun. Thank you so much again.